At 8:17 on a bright Tuesday morning, the emergency department at Redwood Naval Medical Center went from routine to chaos in less than 30 seconds. A military working dog had arrived for a scheduled medical evaluation. 10 minutes later, 3 doctors had backed against a wall. 2 nurses had locked themselves inside a supply room. Security officers were standing at the end of the corridor, and the dog's handler was shouting for everyone to stay away. The K9 was named Ranger. He was a powerful 7-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat, a broad chest, and a faded military harness. He had served for years. He had been trained around aircraft, vehicles, weapons, crowds, and unfamiliar buildings. He wasn't supposed to panic inside a hospital. But something had happened the moment he entered the treatment area, and nobody could understand it. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to see how far these stories travel. Because what happened with Ranger wasn't just about a military dog becoming aggressive. It was about a memory he had carried for years, and a nurse who had no idea he still remembered her. Everybody back. The shout came from Chief Petty Officer Aaron Whitlock, Ranger's current handler. Ranger stood in the center of the corridor. His leash was tight. His body was rigid. His ears were forward. He was barking toward anyone who came near. A physician slowly stepped backward. "Chief, we need to sedate him." Whitlock shook his head. "Not yet." He nearly lunged at Dr. Keller. "I know. Then we can't examine him." Whitlock looked at Ranger. The dog's breathing was heavy. His eyes kept moving between people. "He doesn't normally do this." A security officer looked at him. "He's a military working dog." Whitlock nodded. "Exactly." Ranger had arrived for what should have been a simple orthopedic follow-up. He had developed a slight stiffness in one rear leg during training. Nothing dramatic, no emergency. No reason for panic, but the moment the automatic doors opened, Ranger became uneasy. At first, Whitlock thought it was the smell of disinfectant. Then the fluorescent lights. Then perhaps the unfamiliar echo. He tried familiar commands. "Ranger, heel." Nothing. "Sit." Nothing. The dog continued staring toward the treatment corridor. Then a doctor approached. Ranger barked. The doctor stopped. Another nurse stepped around the corner. Ranger lunged toward her. Whitlock caught the leash. "Easy." Ranger pulled back. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to run. He seemed to be searching, as though something, or someone, was missing. Inside the emergency station, Dr. Nathan Keller watched from behind the glass. "What is he looking for?" Whitlock shook his head. "I don't know. Does he recognize anyone?" "No. Any history of aggression?" "Never toward medical staff." Keller looked at the dog. "Then something here is triggering him." Whitlock nodded. "I think so." The problem was that nobody knew what. At the opposite end of the corridor, Sophie Bennett, a 35-year-old Navy hospital nurse, was finishing her morning rounds. She had shoulder-length chestnut brown hair tied in a low ponytail, hazel eyes, and a calm, professional manner. She wasn't involved with Ranger's case. In fact, she didn't know him. She was carrying a medication tray when she heard the barking. She stopped. Several nurses rushed past her. "Don't go that way." Sophie looked toward the corridor. "What's happening?" "Military K9. Is he injured?" "No. He's just..." The nurse hesitated. "Out of control." Sophie looked through the glass. Ranger was standing several yards away. She watched him for a few seconds. Something about his behavior bothered her. He wasn't behaving like a dog preparing to attack. He was behaving like a dog trying to identify something. His head kept turning. His nose was working constantly. He would look at one person, sniff. Look at another, sniff, then become frustrated. Sophie lowered her medication tray. He's searching. The nurse beside her stared. For what? I don't know. Inside the corridor, another doctor tried to approach. Ranger immediately barked. Whitlock pulled him back. Don't come closer. The doctor raised his hands. I'm trying to help. I know. Ranger's breathing became faster. Whitlock looked down at him. Easy, Ranger. The dog looked up. For 1 second, he was calm. Then he turned his head toward the far end of the hallway. His ears lifted. His nose rose. He sniffed. Sophie was standing there. Ranger stared. Sophie froze. The dog didn't bark. He didn't pull. He simply looked at her. Sophie looked back. Neither moved. Then Ranger sniffed again. His ears shifted. His posture changed, not completely, but enough for Whitlock to notice. What did you do? Sophie looked confused. Nothing. Ranger took one slow step toward her. Whitlock tightened the leash. Stay there. Sophie nodded. Ranger sniffed again, then suddenly began pulling toward her. Whitlock braced himself. Ranger. The dog stopped. He stared at Sophie. Sophie could smell the hospital disinfectant, latex gloves, cleaning solution. Nothing unusual. But she was also wearing a fragrance she had used for years. A light cedar and citrus perfume. She had never thought much about it. Ranger had. Whitlock noticed the change. That's the first time he stopped. Dr. Keller approached the glass. What happened? I don't know. Ranger was still staring at Sophie. Sophie looked uncomfortable. Should I leave? Whitlock shook his head. Wait. Ranger sniffed again. His body relaxed slightly. Then he lowered his head. Sophie took one slow breath. Do you know me? The question was irrational. She had never met him. At least she didn't think she had. Ranger took another step. Whitlock allowed a little slack in the leash. The dog moved forward, then stopped. His nose lifted toward the air. Sophie instinctively touched the collar of her scrub top. Ranger's expression changed. His ears lowered. His tail moved once. Whitlock stared. I've never seen him do that. Sophie whispered. Neither have I. Dr. Keller walked toward them. Ranger immediately became tense again. Sophie looked at him. Maybe he doesn't want anyone else close. Keller stopped. Ranger remained focused on Sophie. Then something strange happened. Sophie turned slightly away. Ranger followed her with his eyes. She took one step toward the examination room. Ranger moved with her. Whitlock looked stunned. That's incredible. Sophie frowned. I don't understand. Neither did anyone else. The medical staff began trying to determine why Sophie hadn't interacted with Ranger before. She hadn't been his handler. She wasn't wearing military equipment. She wasn't giving commands. She was simply standing there, and the dog was becoming calmer around her. Whitlock looked at her. What's your perfume? Sophie blinked. My what? Your fragrance, she laughed nervously. Cedar and citrus. Whitlock looked at Ranger. You think that's what he smells? Maybe. Sophie looked confused. But thousands of people wear perfume. Not this exact combination. Dr. Keller shook his head. We shouldn't assume. Sophie nodded. Agreed. But Ranger was already giving them another clue. He moved closer. Then he gently pressed his nose against Sophie's hand. The entire corridor became silent. Sophie slowly lowered her hand. Ranger sniffed it. Then he closed his eyes. For the first time since entering the hospital, he looked completely calm. Whitlock whispered, What just happened? Sophie didn't answer. Because something inside her had suddenly become familiar. Not the dog. The moment, the way he had approached. The way he had sniffed her hand. The way his ears had relaxed. And then she remembered something, a training facility. Years ago, a young German shepherd. A woman in a Navy K-9 uniform. A dog who had refused to leave her side. Sophie stared at Ranger, her face changed. No. Whitlock looked at her. What? She looked closer at the dog's face, the eyes, the small white mark near his left paw, the slight bend in his right ear, and suddenly she remembered. Ranger? The dog lifted his head. Sophie took one step closer. Ranger? The dog stared at her. His tail moved once. Twice. Then he made a quiet sound deep in his throat. Not a bark. Something softer, something almost like recognition. Whitlock's mouth fell open. You know him? Sophie looked at him. I think. Her voice trembled. I used to be his handler. The corridor went silent. Dr. Keller stared at her. You were? Sophie nodded slowly. Years ago. How long? Almost 3 years. Whitlock looked at Ranger, then at Sophie. Why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't know he was here. Ranger was still standing beside her. His head was against her hand. Sophie gently touched his fur, and suddenly the memories came flooding back. Ranger as a young working dog. Ranger learning his first search pattern. Ranger sleeping beside her chair. Ranger waiting outside her office. The day she had been transferred. The day another handler had taken over. The last time she had seen him. She had believed he had forgotten her. She had been wrong. Dr. Keller looked at the dog. So he recognized your scent? Sophie nodded. Possibly. Whitlock looked at her. That's why he calmed down. Sophie shook her head. Not exactly. What do you mean? He recognized something familiar. She looked at Ranger. Maybe the fragrance was part of it. But dogs don't remember perfume the way people remember a bottle. Whitlock listened. They remember scent as part of a larger memory. Sophie looked down at Ranger. My voice, my uniform, my hands, the places we worked, the way I smelled. She paused. All of it. Ranger leaned against her leg. Sophie closed her eyes. She hadn't expected to see him again. Certainly not like this. And she had no idea that somewhere in the dog's memory, she had never really left. The hospital team slowly began stepping back. For the first time, nobody was trying to control Ranger. They were letting him choose, and he had chosen. He stayed beside Sophie. Dr. Keller whispered, Can we examine him? Sophie looked at Ranger, then at Whitlock. Let me help. Whitlock nodded. Sophie slowly walked toward the treatment room. Ranger followed. No barking, no lunging, no panic. Every doctor in the corridor watched in disbelief. The same dog who had frightened nearly everyone 10 minutes earlier was now walking calmly beside the nurse. And nobody understood what they were witnessing yet. Because the real story wasn't that a perfume had magically calmed a military K-9. It was that a scent had unlocked a memory of the person who had once made him feel safe. And as Ranger stepped into the examination room beside Sophie, the entire hospital was about to discover just how deep that connection really was. Ranger walked into the treatment room beside Sophie. Nobody followed immediately. For several seconds, the entire corridor remained frozen. The same German shepherd who had forced doctors against the walls was now walking calmly beside a nurse who had apparently once been his handler. Chief Petty Officer Aaron Whitlock slowly followed. Easy, he whispered. Ranger didn't react. His eyes remained on Sophie. Dr. Nathan Keller watched from the other side of the room. Let's not rush this. Sophie nodded. She understood. Ranger had remembered her. But recognition wasn't the same thing as complete trust, especially after whatever had caused him to become so distressed. Sophie crouched beside the examination table. Ranger stopped beside her. She didn't reach for him. Instead, she let him decide. He lowered his head. His nose moved toward her shoulder. Then he sniffed the cedar and citrus fragrance again. His breathing slowed. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment. "Hey, Ranger." The dog lifted his head. "You remember me?" His tail moved once. Sophie smiled through tears. "I remember you." Whitlock stood several feet away. He looked completely stunned. "I've been his handler for almost 2 years." Sophie looked at him. "And you've done a good job. Then why didn't he calm down for me?" Sophie shook her head. "He wasn't rejecting you." "Then what was happening?" "He was overwhelmed." She looked toward the treatment corridor. Something triggered a memory. Whitlock frowned. "Of what?" Sophie hesitated. "Of losing someone." Whitlock's expression changed. "Someone?" "His previous handler." She looked at Ranger. "Me." Ranger had been only 18 months old when Sophie first received him. At that time, he wasn't the confident working dog everyone saw today. He was nervous around unfamiliar people. He startled at sudden movement. He disliked enclosed spaces. Sophie had spent months building his confidence. Not through force, through repetition, consistency, trust. Every morning she arrived at the training facility at the same time. She used the same voice, the same basic commands, the same reward routine. And eventually, Ranger stopped watching the door whenever she entered. He started waiting for her, then following her, then trusting her. Their partnership became strong enough that the instructors began using them as an example of handler K-9 communication. Until one day, Sophie received orders for a medical transfer. Not Ranger, her. She had developed a wrist injury that made certain K-9 duties difficult. The decision wasn't hers. Another handler would take over. Sophie had been told it was temporary, but temporary became permanent. Ranger adapted. Military dogs had to. He continued training. He continued working. And Sophie eventually left the K-9 program entirely. She never expected to see him again. Now, years later, he was standing beside her. And somehow, he still knew her. Dr. Keller approached cautiously. Ranger immediately turned his head. Sophie raised her hand. "Stay." Ranger looked at her, then relaxed. Keller stopped. "That's incredible." Sophie smiled faintly. "It's familiar. Can you get him onto the examination table?" "I think so." She looked at Ranger. "Ranger." The dog watched her. "Up." Ranger placed his front paws against the low step, then climbed onto the examination platform. Every doctor in the room stared. Whitlock shook his head. "He hasn't responded to that command since we entered." Sophie looked at him. "He's probably still processing whatever scared him." Keller nodded. "And you're reducing the stress." "Exactly." The examination finally began. Ranger remained unusually calm. Dr. Keller carefully checked his leg. Ranger didn't pull away. His breathing remained steady. The doctor looked at Sophie. "How did you do that?" Sophie smiled. "I didn't." "What?" I reminded him of something he already knew. Keller looked confused. "What?" "That he's safe." The examination revealed that Ranger's leg stiffness was minor. Nothing explained his earlier behavior. The veterinary team checked his temperature. Normal. Heart rate. Normal. Neurological response. Normal. There was no obvious medical emergency. But the question remained. Why had he become so aggressive? Sophie thought about it. Where was he before he came here? Whitlock answered. Training compound. Which section? Canine conditioning wing. Sophie frowned. Any new equipment? Yes. What kind? A new ventilation system. Sophie looked at Keller. Was it tested? Whitlock nodded. This morning. Before he arrived? Yes. Sophie thought. What did he do when you entered? He became tense immediately. Did he react before the doors opened? Whitlock paused. Yes. Sophie looked toward him. How? He stopped walking. Then, He started sniffing. Sophie nodded. That matters. Dogs process the world through scent in ways humans cannot. A familiar odor can be tied to an entire collection of memories, a place, a person, a routine, a period of safety. Sophie knew that, but she also knew something else. Ranger hadn't simply smelled her perfume. He had probably smelled a familiar combination of scent molecules, carried on her clothes, skin, and hair. The fragrance had been part of the pattern, not a magic trigger, a memory cue. That distinction mattered, and it was exactly why Ranger had calmed. Sophie looked at Whitlock. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Did you bring his old training blanket?" Whitlock frowned. "His old one?" "Yes, we still have it." "Where?" "In the vehicle." Sophie nodded. "Bring it." Whitlock went outside. Several minutes later, he returned carrying a faded olive-green blanket. Ranger immediately lifted his head. His nose moved, then his ears rose. Sophie looked at him. "You remember that too?" Whitlock slowly placed the blanket near him. Ranger sniffed it, then looked at Sophie. Sophie smiled. "See?" Whitlock stared. "That's the same reaction. Because the blanket carries old scent." He looked at her. "And you're part of that memory." Sophie nodded. "Probably." Whitlock sat down. "I've wondered why he keeps sleeping with his nose against old equipment." Sophie looked at him. "Because scent is information." "What kind?" "Everything." She smiled. "Where he's been. Who was there? What happened?" Whitlock looked at Ranger. "So he wasn't trying to attack everyone?" "No. What was he doing?" Sophie thought. "Trying to find something familiar." "And he found you?" "Yes." The news spread quickly. The hospital staff who had watched Ranger become aggressive now gathered at a safe distance. But the atmosphere had completely changed. There was no fear. There was fascination. Dr. Keller looked through the glass. "I can't believe this." Another doctor nodded. "Neither can I." Whitlock smiled. "I can." They looked at him. He pointed toward Sophie. "Because I know that look." Sophie frowned. "What look?" "The look he used to give you." She smiled. "I thought he'd forgotten." Whitlock shook his head. "Apparently not." At noon, Ranger's behavior was completely different. He walked through the treatment corridor without barking. He passed 2 doctors. Nothing. A nurse approached. Nothing. A security officer walked by. Ranger remained calm. Then Sophie walked ahead. Ranger followed. Whitlock watched. "That's unbelievable." Sophie laughed. "He knows where he's going." "After all these years?" "Apparently." But Sophie wasn't satisfied yet. Something had triggered Ranger before he recognized her. And she wanted to know what. She asked the hospital maintenance supervisor to review the new ventilation system. The technician checked the records. It was activated at 7:55. "When did Ranger arrive?" 8:05. Sophie nodded. 10 minutes. "Yes." "Was anything unusual about the system?" The technician hesitated. "It produces a higher frequency vibration during startup." Sophie looked at him. "How high?" "Humans barely notice it." She looked toward Ranger. "And dogs?" The technician shrugged. "Potentially much more sensitive." Sophie understood. Ranger had likely been exposed to an unfamiliar vibration and airflow before entering the treatment area. The hospital's unfamiliar smells and sounds had added more stress. Then every doctor approaching him had increased the pressure. By the time Sophie arrived, he was already overwhelmed. And her scent had provided the first familiar signal. Dr. Keller listened carefully. So the perfume wasn't the entire reason. Sophie shook her head. "No." "What was?" "The memory." He nodded. "And the fragrance unlocked it." "Exactly." That afternoon, Sophie sat beside Ranger while Whitlock completed his paperwork. Ranger rested his head against her knee. Whitlock looked over. I've never seen him this relaxed. Sophie smiled. Neither have I in years. Whitlock hesitated. Do you want to know something? What? He's changed since you left. Sophie looked at him. How? He became more independent. She smiled. That's good, yes. Whitlock paused, but when he's tired, he still sleeps with his head against the door. Sophie froze. Which door? The handler office. Her eyes became wet. That's where he used to wait for me. Whitlock nodded. I figured. Sophie reached down and gently touched Ranger's head. The dog didn't open his eyes. He simply leaned closer. She whispered, I'm sorry I disappeared. Ranger remained still. Whitlock looked away. He understood that some conversations weren't meant for anyone else. Later that afternoon, Dr. Keller found Sophie in the corridor. I've spoken with the hospital director. Sophie looked worried. About what? About you, she sighed. Why? Because everyone wants to know how you handled him. I didn't handle him. You calmed him. He recognized me. That's exactly why. Keller smiled. We want you to help us create a canine behavioral response procedure. Sophie looked surprised. I'm a nurse, and you understand working dogs. She smiled. Those aren't the same profession. No, Keller nodded. But they can work together. At 4:30 p.m., Ranger was cleared to leave. Whitlock prepared his harness. Ranger stood calmly. He looked at Sophie, then at Whitlock, then back at Sophie. Whitlock laughed. He's waiting. Sophie smiled. For what? Permission. Sophie looked at Ranger. Go. Ranger didn't move. She laughed. Ranger, go home. The dog finally turned. He walked toward Whitlock, then stopped. He looked back. Sophie raised her hand. Go. This time, he followed his handler. The hospital staff gathered near the entrance. The doctors, who had once backed away from Ranger, were now watching peacefully. Dr. Keller approached Sophie. You changed the entire situation. Sophie shook her head. He remembered me. Keller smiled. And you remembered him. Sophie looked toward Ranger. Yes. Whitlock stopped beside her before leaving. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think he'll remember you next time? Sophie smiled. I think he already has. Whitlock nodded. Then he looked toward the dog. Thank you. Sophie looked at him. For what? For giving me my partner back. Sophie smiled. You never lost him. She glanced at Ranger. He just needed to remember where he was safe. Whitlock's eyes became wet. He nodded, then he walked away. Sophie stood at the hospital entrance long after they left. She could still smell the faint cedar and citrus fragrance on her sleeve. The scent had been ordinary to her, just perfume, something she had worn for years without thinking. But to Ranger, it had been a doorway back to a person, a place, a partnership. A time when he had been young and uncertain, and she had been the one teaching him that the world wasn't something to fear. Sophie smiled. She had spent years wondering whether Ranger remembered her. Now she had her answer. He did, and somehow he had remembered before she did. That evening, Sophie received a message from Whitlock. It contained a photograph. Ranger was lying peacefully inside the transport vehicle. His head rested on the old green blanket. Underneath the photograph, Whitlock had written, "He slept the entire way back." Sophie smiled. Then another message appeared. He kept his nose on the blanket the whole time. Sophie stared at the screen, her eyes filled with tears. She typed, "Take care of him." Whitlock replied, "Always." If this story is touching your heart, subscribe and stay with us for more emotional military Terry K9 stories about loyalty, memory, and the extraordinary bond between service members and their dogs. Because sometimes a dog doesn't need a command to remember someone. Sometimes all it needs is a scent. The next morning, Sophie returned to work. She expected everything to feel normal. But it didn't. People greeted her differently. Doctors who had once barely noticed her stopped to thank her. Security officers smiled. The veterinary staff asked questions. Even nurses from other departments had heard what happened. But Sophie didn't feel like a hero. She simply felt grateful. Because Ranger had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing. Closure years ago, she had walked away from him, believing their story was finished. Now she knew it hadn't been. It had simply been waiting. And somewhere on the base, a 7-year-old German shepherd was carrying a memory of the woman who had once been his handler. A memory hidden inside scent. A memory that had survived years. And a connection that had taken only one breath to return. 3 weeks after the incident at Redwood Naval Medical Center, Sophie Bennett was finishing her morning shift when she heard a familiar sound outside the veterinary wing. A leash clip, then footsteps. She stopped. For a moment, she didn't move. Another sound followed, a soft scratch against the floor. Sophie smiled. She already knew Ranger was back, not for an emergency this time, for a routine follow-up. She walked toward the veterinary corridor and saw him through the glass. The 7-year-old German shepherd stood beside Chief Petty Officer Aaron Whitlock. His posture was relaxed. His ears were alert. His eyes were bright. He looked completely different from the frightened dog, who had once sent an entire hospital into panic. Then he saw Sophie. His ears lifted. His tail moved. Whitlock noticed. "Well," he said with a grin, "looks like somebody remembered you." Sophie laughed. "I think he did." The door opened. Ranger walked inside. Sophie remained where she was. She didn't call him. She didn't reach for him. She simply waited. Ranger walked past Whitlock, past the examination table, then stopped directly in front of Sophie. He lifted his nose. He smelled her hand, then gently pressed his head against her leg. Sophie closed her eyes. "Hi, Ranger." The dog remained there. Whitlock smiled. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "He doesn't react to your perfume anymore." Sophie looked at him. "What do you mean?" "He recognizes you before he gets close enough to smell it." She smiled. "Then maybe it isn't the perfume." Whitlock nodded. Maybe it never was. That was something Sophie had thought about constantly since the incident. The perfume had not magically calmed Ranger. It hadn't contained some secret chemical that made him obedient. Dogs simply have an extraordinary sense of smell, and familiar scents can become connected with places, people, and experiences. For Ranger, Sophie's fragrance had probably been one small piece of a much larger memory. Her voice, her movement, her scent, her old uniform, the way she handled his leash, the routines they had shared, the feeling of safety associated with all of it. The fragrance had simply been the first clue he could recognize. And once he recognized it, he recognized her. Dr. Nathan Keller approached. "How's my favorite patient?" Ranger looked at him. No barking, no growling, nothing. Keller laughed. "I still can't believe this is the same dog." Sophie smiled. "He was never a bad dog." Keller nodded. "I know that now." He looked towards Sophie. "You taught us something." "What?" "Sometimes behavior that looks aggressive is actually fear." Sophie looked at Ranger. "Sometimes." Keller smiled. "Fair enough." The routine examination went perfectly. Ranger stood calmly. He allowed the doctors to check his leg. He tolerated the equipment. He even allowed Keller to examine his ears without hesitation. The same doctor he had once nearly lunged at. Keller stepped backward. "Done." Ranger looked towards Sophie. She smiled. Good boy. Ranger's tail moved. Keller laughed. He's still taking your approval over mine. Sophie shook her head. He's just being polite. When the examination ended, Whitlock asked Sophie to walk outside with him. They stopped beneath the bright afternoon sun near the hospital entrance. There's something I wanted to tell you. Sophie looked at him. What? Ranger has been different since that day. How? Calmer, she smiled. That's good. He still works hard, still has the same drive. Whitlock paused. But he's less reactive when something unfamiliar happens. Sophie nodded. That's probably because you changed how you handle those moments. Whitlock smiled. You changed how I handle those moments. She shook her head. No, you did. Sophie looked at him. I just reminded you to listen. Whitlock nodded. Sometimes that's enough. A few days later, Redwood Naval Medical Center officially introduced a new training session for hospital staff who worked around military K-9s. It wasn't complicated. There were no dramatic demonstrations. Staff learned to recognize warning signs, changes in posture, position, breathing, pacing, ceasing, avoidance, sudden fixation. They learned that a dog could look aggressive while actually being frightened. And they learned that handlers should be part of medical treatment whenever possible. Sophie helped teach the session. She stood in front of a group of doctors and nurses. Don't assume the loudest behavior tells you the whole story. One doctor raised a hand. What should we look for first? Sophie answered context. Another asked, what comes second? Body language. And third. Sophie smiled. Give the dog time to tell you what you missed. Chief Petty Officer Whitlock stood in the back of the room. He smiled. Ranger sat beside him. The dog was calm, almost bored. A nurse walked past. Ranger didn't react. A cart rolled by. Nothing. A door slammed somewhere down the corridor. Ranger looked up. Then looked at Whitlock. Whitlock waited. Ranger relaxed. Sophie noticed. She smiled. That was progress. Not because Ranger had stopped reacting. Because he had learned he didn't have to remain afraid after every unexpected sound. Later that month, Sophie received an envelope. Inside was a photograph. It showed Ranger several years earlier, a much younger dog standing beside a woman in a military K-9 uniform, Sophie. She stared at the picture for a long time. On the back was a handwritten note from Whitlock. Found this in his old training file. Below it, thought you should have it. Sophie sat down. She traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. She remembered that day. Ranger had been young, nervous. Too distracted to complete a simple search exercise. She had sat on the floor beside him for nearly 40 minutes. She hadn't commanded him. She hadn't forced him. She had simply waited. Eventually, Ranger had placed his chin on her knee. That had been the beginning. Sophie smiled through tears. For years, she had remembered that day as the moment she had finally earned Ranger's trust. Now she realized something else. Maybe he had been teaching her too. He had taught her patience, observation, humility, and the difference between controlling an animal and understanding one. Those lessons had followed her into nursing. They had helped her with frightened patients, confused patients, people who couldn't explain what they were feeling. And now, years later, those same lessons had brought her back to Ranger. One afternoon, Whitlock called Sophie. Do you have a minute? Sure. I need your opinion. About what? Ranger has a deployment evaluation next month. Sophie became serious. What kind? Environmental stress assessment. She thought for a moment. What's concerning you? He's recovered, but I want to make sure the hospital incident doesn't affect him. Sophie nodded. Bring him to the hospital? Yes. Whitlock laughed. You're inviting a military K-9 back into the place where he almost attacked everyone? Sophie smiled. Exactly. The next morning, Ranger returned. This time there was no emergency. No crowded corridor. No unfamiliar team surrounding him. Sophie and Whitlock walked him slowly through the same entrance where the original incident had happened. Ranger stopped. His nose lifted. He sniffed. Sue watched carefully. For a moment, his body became tense. Whitlock noticed. Should we leave? Sophie shook her head. No. Ranger looked toward the treatment corridor, then toward Sophie. She didn't command him. She simply stood beside him. After several seconds, Ranger took one step forward, then another. His posture relaxed. They continued walking. Sophie smiled. Good. Whitlock looked at her. That's it? She nodded. That's it. They reached the treatment room. Ranger walked inside. The same room, the same floor, the same doors, the same medical smells. He looked around. Then he walked toward the examination table, stopped, sniffed, and sat. Whitlock stared. That's where everything happened. Sophie nodded. Ranger looked toward her. She smiled. You remember. His tail moved, then he lowered his head, calm. Whitlock looked emotional. He came back here. Sophie nodded. Yes, and nothing happened. Exactly. Whitlock smiled. That's what you wanted. Sophie looked at Ranger. Not just for him. What do you mean? For me too. Whitlock understood. Sophie had spent years wondering whether leaving the K-9 program had meant abandoning something important. But standing in that room, she finally understood. Her story with Ranger hadn't ended when she transferred away. It had simply changed. Before they left, Ranger walked toward Sophie. He sniffed her sleeve. The faint cedar and citrus fragrance was still there. He recognized it. But this time, he didn't need it. He already knew her. Sophie crouched. Ranger rested his head against her shoulder. She whispered, "You remembered." Whitlock stood several feet away. He didn't interrupt. Neither did anyone else. It was their moment. That evening, Sophie received another message. This time from Dr. Keller. The staff wanted me to thank you. Sophie smiled. Another message arrived. Nobody is afraid of Ranger anymore. Then, and nobody sees you as just a nurse anymore. Sophie stared at that sentence. She wasn't sure how she felt about it, because she had never wanted to be seen as extraordinary. She had simply wanted to help. She replied, "That's all I ever wanted." The following week, the hospital held a small recognition gathering. Nothing elaborate, no press, no cameras. Just hospital staff, several Navy personnel, the K-9 handlers, and a few doctors. Dr. Keller stepped forward. "We're here for someone who reminded us that expertise doesn't always announce itself." Sophie immediately knew who he meant. He continued. She noticed what others overlooked. He looked toward her. She understood a frightened animal when everyone else saw aggression. The room applauded. Sophie looked embarrassed. Then Whitlock stepped forward. Ranger sat beside him. Whitlock crouched and removed the dog's old, faded training tag from a protective pouch. He held it toward Sophie. This belonged to Ranger during his first training assignment. Sophie stared. "I can't take that. You don't have to." He smiled. "But I want you to hold it." She accepted it. Her fingers closed around the worn metal. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Ranger stood. He walked toward Sophie. The room became quiet. He stopped beside her. Sophie lowered herself. Ranger gently touched his nose to the hand, holding the old tag. Sophie laughed through tears. Everyone around them smiled. Whitlock whispered, "He remembers everything." Sophie looked at Ranger. "Maybe not everything." She gently stroked his head, but enough. That moment became the photograph people remembered. Not because a dangerous dog had been defeated. Not because a nurse had performed some impossible trick, but because a military working dog had recognized the person who once gave him confidence, and the person he recognized had never stopped caring about him. If you've stayed with this story until the end, subscribe for more emotional, military K9 stories about loyalty, second chances, and the extraordinary memories these dogs carry with them. And if your dog has ever recognized you after a long separation, tell us about that moment in the comments. We'd genuinely love to hear your story. Months later, Ranger returned to the hospital one final time. This time, he wasn't there as a patient. He was there for a training demonstration. A group of new medical staff stood in the corridor. Sophie explained how to recognize canine stress. Ranger sat beside Whitlock. Calm, Buffost, one of the trainees asked, "How did you know the perfume would calm him?" Sophie smiled. "I didn't." The trainee looked surprised. "Then what did you know?" Sophie looked at Ranger. "I knew he was trying to find something familiar. Was it the fragrance? Maybe partly. Then what was it really?" Sophie smiled. "Memory." She paused. "A scent can open the door, but the relationship is what's behind it." The room became quiet. Ranger looked up at her. Sophie smiled. "That's what he taught me." Whitlock looked at Ranger. The dog was watching Sophie. Not because she was holding food, not because she had a command, not because he was afraid, because she was familiar. She was part of his history, part of his training, part of a time when the world had been simpler, and that connection had survived years. As the demonstration ended, Sophie walked toward the exit. Ranger followed. Whitlock laughed. "Looks like he's still your shadow." Sophie looked back. "No." Ranger stopped beside her. She smiled. "He's just saying goodbye." Whitlock nodded. Ranger sniffed her hand one last time. Then he turned and walked back to his handler. Sophie watched him go. There was sadness in her eyes. But this time, it wasn't the sadness of losing him. It was the peace of knowing that he had remembered. She stood there until Ranger disappeared around the corner. Then she looked down at the old training tag in her hand. The same tag Whitlock had given her months earlier. She closed her fingers around it. For years, Sophie had wondered whether the dog she once loved had forgotten her. She finally knew the answer: he hadn't. Not really, because dogs don't remember people the way humans do. They remember through patterns, through scent, through voices, through places, through feelings, and sometimes, after years have passed, one familiar fragrance can open a door that time never completely closed. Ranger had smelled Sophie that morning. And somewhere inside that powerful military K9's memory, the frightened young dog who once waited beside her had recognized the woman who had taught him what safety felt like. He hadn't attacked the doctors because he was vicious. He hadn't become dangerous because he had forgotten his training. He had simply been overwhelmed. And when he found something familiar, he found his way back. Sophie watched the empty corridor, then smiled. Because sometimes the strongest bond between a human and a dog doesn't disappear when they separate. It simply waits, quietly, until one day, a familiar scent brings everything back.